This video is proudly sponsored by War Thunder. More on them later.
Vast, sophisticated trench networks. Entire divisions wiped off the map in desperate assaults across a cratered no man's land. Stalemates that lasted for years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. We have a very clear picture in our minds when we think of the First World War. But not every front was like this. The Western and Eastern fronts characterized the industrial horror of combat in a new century, but other areas saw markedly less action. This is not to say there wasn't bloodshed. Horror and tragedy were unavoidable in the First World War. Whether on the banks of the Piave River, in the jungles of Tanzania, or in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, human beings lost their lives in horrific fashion, cut down by the first truly global conflict the world had ever seen. But these fronts have been largely forgotten in history, pushed aside in favor of words that still carry enormous cultural weight to this day. Words like Somme, Ypres, Tannenberg, and Gallipoli. Today, we're going to shift the focus. We're going to look at some of the lesser known fronts of the war. Fronts where the fighting was not quite as ferocious, but where the lives of soldiers and civilians were ripped apart nonetheless. These are important stories, and they deserve to be told.
But before we get into the chill parts of World War I, if you want to spend a chill night gaming, look no further than War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. Step into the role of commander with access to an exclusive arsenal of over 2,500 tanks, aircraft, helicopters, and naval vessels from 10 leading countries. Your resources span nearly a century of military technology, starting with the early biplanes and armored vehicles of the 1920s through to the cutting-edge fighter jets and advanced main battle tanks of the modern era, where the sounds of battle are as true to life as it gets and the graphics are so sharp you'll feel like you're in the driver's seat of history's most epic machinery. And let me tell you, the level of detail blew our minds. Each vehicle isn't just a model, it's a fully realized piece of machinery with authentic damage models. Get hit and you'll know exactly what went wrong, from a punctured engine to a taken out crew member. Thanks to an in-house engine, War Thunder offers a seamless experience with stunning graphics and smooth performance, even on less powerful rigs. And let's not forget the massive global community. Join over 70 million players in epic PvP battles in a game that offers a breathtaking experience, unparalleled in its depth of high quality content, especially for enthusiasts of military history. Sign up with my link below, and new or returning players who haven't played in the last 6 months get a colossal bonus pack. We're talking multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive vehicle decorator, the Eagle of Valor, a whopping 100,000 silver lions, and a whole week of premium account access. So what are you waiting for? Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. Claim your bonus, and I'll see you on the battlefield.
The eastern sector of the Italian front brought about the ruin of both the Italian armed forces and the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. The former came on November 7th, 1917 at the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, the now infamous Battle of Caporetto. Here, after more than 2 weeks of fighting, the Italian forces under Luigi Cadorna capitulated spectacularly under an Austro-Hungarian assault, falling back from the front line along the modern border with Slovenia and giving up around 100 kilometers of Italian territory in the process. The battle has become famous in Italy and elsewhere as a symbol of humiliating defeat, while Luigi Cadorna's incompetence at the head of the Italian forces has passed into legend. There are many common threads running through the First World War, but one that comes up time and time again is the idea of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. After the Italian collapse, the way was almost clear for a sweeping Austro-Hungarian victory. However, alarmed by what was going on the Isonzo, the Entente powers sent British and French divisions to halt the advance, which they did along the Piave River, some 30 kilometers from Venice. Another Austrian offensive in June would push the lines beyond the river, but as summer 1918 gave way to autumn, a new stalemate had arisen along the Italian front. This stalemate would not last though. In October, almost a year after Caporetto, Entente and Italian divisions launched a final, fatal assault. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto would be the Austrians' turn to capitulate. With their army shattered and their war effort destroyed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was humiliated. This would be one of the key catalysts in the disintegration of the once proud Habsburg dynasty. The following month, the war would be over. The eastern sector of the Italian front was critical in many ways, keeping the Central Powers at bay in the southeast, and eventually leading to the demise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 12 battles were fought along the Isonzo, and more were fought as Austria pushed into Italy before being repulsed. This might seem like an odd choice for this list, and in a way, it is. There are other, far more qualified candidates to come. But compared to the industrial-scale carnage of the Western and Eastern fronts, the Isonzo was relatively quiet. The Macedonian Front is known by several different names. The Salonica Front, the Thessaloniki Front, or the South Front, depending on who you ask. Around 600 meters long, the front traversed the rocky highlands of the southern Balkans, passing through Albania, Greece, and Bulgaria, as well as Serbia, which included the modern nation of Northern Macedonia within its 1915 territory. The front was a barrier, a bottleneck that kept the Triple Entente forces from reaching the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the east. Along this finely poised line, the French, Serbian, British, Russian, Italian, and Greek troops of the Entente were stationed. Opposing them, Bulgarian, German, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The atmosphere was tense. Earlier in 1915, the Entente campaigns in the Dardanelles had descended into a bloody mess that left tens of thousands of British, French, Australian, and New Zealander dead on the beaches and heights of Western Turkey. In the autumn of that same year, the Serbian and Montenegrin armies gallantly withstood devastating assaults from the Austro-Hungarian divisions in the west and from the Bulgarians in the east, squeezing the country in a vice. After bitter fighting, the Serbians were driven south, joining their Entente allies along the Macedonian front. This front, the Entente knew, could not fall. After the bloodshed of 1915, a new front and a new year brought relative calm to the Balkans. Romania remained neutral, and much of 1916 was given up to diplomatic negotiations with this important regional power. Greece, as well, despite the presence of their own soldiers along the line, and despite the Entente forces within their borders, also adopted a neutral position. By the summer, both had joined the Entente, each finding this to be the best option for their own nationalist interests. But Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian actions in August took the Allied nations by surprise. The first clashes along the Macedonian front went the way of the Central Powers, but the Entente stopped their advance, retaking Florina and the highlands of Kamakchalan in September, and eventually occupying the entire Dobro Pole Massif, a position of enormous strategic importance. As 1917 began, the Entente had essentially lost one of its newest allies. The Romanian armed forces had been shattered, and the country was occupied by Entente troops eager to keep the Bulgarians contained. Throughout the year, scattered actions were fought around the town of Bitola, and close-range artillery fire made Entente control of the region impossible. Yet, the front largely remained static until the following September, when fighting stepped up several notches. Entente troops broke through the line from the Dobro Pole Massif on September 15, 1918. Driving northward, the advancing forces sent shockwaves through Bulgarian troops, and the nation signed an armistice on September 30th, essentially leaving the Ottoman Empire exposed. The Ottomans would sign their own armistice a month later. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungarian operations in Italy were turning from an optimistic advance into a full-scale catastrophe. With the Italian border now unguarded, their Balkan territories vulnerable to attack, and their empire crumbling, the Austrians put their signature to an armistice on November 4th. The war ended 7 days later. Long periods of tense inactivity and diplomatic maneuvering characterized the Macedonian front. While the battles were smaller than those on the western and eastern fronts, with fewer casualties and mercifully less bloodshed, the sudden uptick in intensity right at the end of the war makes this an important theatre. The rapid House of Cards collapse in the southern Balkans may not have ended the war all by itself, but many historians believe this to be a crucial accelerator in the signing of the final armistice on November 11th, 1918. The colonial legacy of the 19th century still loomed large over the first decades of the 20th. Tirailleurs Senegalese fought and died as part of the French army on the Western Front. Indian Sikh troops battled courageously at the Somme and elsewhere. The Kingdom of Siam, eager to establish itself as an independent power between British and French colonies in Southeast Asia, sent their own contingent of men to join the fray in Europe. Away from the main European fronts, the war was largely fought along colonial lines. Of the main belligerents, France, Britain, Belgium, Germany, and Italy all held extensive territories in Africa, and this meant land and resources that must be defended, and men who could do the defending. Right from the outset, there was fighting in Africa. British and French troops occupied Togo in August 1914, pursuing the Germans back to Camerun, modern-day Cameroon. At Garoua, the fortress changed hands several times between Entente and German troops before an amphibious landing at Douala gave Britain and France an important foothold in Cameroon. It would take another year and a half to drive the Germans out of Cameroon, during which time they would lead an incursion into Nigeria in an attempt to destabilize the British colony there. At the Battle of Gurin in 1915, the Nigerian campaign floundered. Germany would lose Mora, their final stronghold in Cameroon, in February the following year. In the east, Germany had a little more success. After a British force sailed from India and landed at Tanga, Tanzania in November 1914, hundreds of Indian troops were killed by the German and African defenders, abandoning much of their equipment as they fled. In July 1915, the Battle of Rufiji Delta was fought by British and German warships off the Tanzanian coast and on her rivers, resulting in significant losses for both sides. Inland, a more bizarre naval encounter unfolded on Lake Tanganyika, in which a small force of British motor boats, carried up on trains from South Africa and dragged through the jungle to the lake, took on 3 German craft. The motorboats knocked out 2 of the craft, but it took Belgian air power to take down the 3rd. Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, the architect of victory at Tanga, surprised the garrison in Mozambique. Lettow-Vorbeck scored another win, inflicting up to 200 casualties on the British and on neutral Portuguese troops. Some men were reportedly eaten by crocodiles while attempting to escape. This victory sustained Lettow-Vorbeck and his 1,500 men for months. Even after the armistice was signed in Europe, the colonel kept on fighting, eventually surrendering 2 weeks later in what is now Zambia. Germany's war and its African colonial ambition was finished. The scattered fighting and lower-level skirmishes of the African Front make it something of a sideshow compared with the industrial bloodshed of the war's primary fronts. Despite this, colonial holdings provided valuable resources to the European powers, and this was the last of the war's fronts to officially close. Persia proclaimed its neutrality at the outbreak of the First World War, but such a strategically vital region was never going to escape the conflict unscathed. The crossroads of Asia, Persia had British India to its east, the Russian Empire to the north, and the Ottomans to the south and west. There was going to be bloodshed here, whether the Persians themselves got involved or not. Heavy Ottoman and Russian buildups in the area meant hostilities began almost right away. The Ottomans defeated the Russian Bergman offensive in November 1914, and in December, the Russians pulled out of Persia, leaving only 1 brigade and 1 battalion behind. As 1915 dawned, German agents began agitating for revolts among the local population, encouraging them to rise up and join the advancing Ottomans. In the early days of the year, the Russians launched an offensive, capturing Tabriz and Dilman and driving the Ottoman forces back. By spring, however, the Ottoman 1st Expeditionary Force was advancing under the command of Halil Bey, but a series of blunders meant they could not dislodge the Russian forces they encountered. As the year wore on, both sides found themselves distracted by actions taking place elsewhere. The Caucasus campaign siphoned off troops and resources for both sides, while Turkish forces were dealing with an allied assault along the Dardanelles. As Britain and Germany attempted to exert their own influence on local chiefs, the Russians were preparing for their most successful advance to date. In 1916, they drove southwards through Persia following the Battle of Erzurum, driving the Ottoman gendarmerie out of their strongholds. Enver Pasha, one of the three pashas at the head of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, prepared his invasion force, and the two imperial powers were deadlocked once again. Russian involvement in the war would not survive 1917. Revolution back home meant Russia was no longer a force, and their withdrawal left the Ottomans largely unopposed in Persia. The British forces in Mesopotamia seemed reluctant to push further east, and so the Armenian volunteers and resistance groups would need to fight on alone. Despite significant losses elsewhere in the Middle East, the Ottomans were still in control of the region when the armistice was signed in 1918. The Persian Front brought less military bloodshed than other fronts of the war, but it took a significant toll on the civilian population. The Ottomans in particular exacted bloody revenge on the civilian populations of the areas they conquered. Thousands of Armenians, Assyrians, and Persians were massacred by advancing Ottoman forces. Even on the war's quieter fronts, the grim spectre of atrocity still haunts the conflict. T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, is one of the most unique characters of the First World War. A scholar of history and architecture, as well as a civilian cartographer and explorer, Lawrence's knowledge of the Middle East and his ability to cope with the terrain and climate made him a valuable asset in this theatre. When the Arab Revolt took place in 1916, the Ottoman occupiers of the Arabian Peninsula were no match for the tough and resourceful Bedouin peoples from the south, people who were well versed in desert survival and swift movement across an inhospitable landscape. But the Ottomans were better equipped and had the weight of numbers behind them. While the British were nominally on the side of the Arabs, there was a vast gulf in terms of military tactics and cultural understanding. It would be almost impossible to achieve a cohesive response to the Ottoman occupation. But T.E. Lawrence thought differently. He understood Western martial strategy, but he admired the hardiness and wisdom of the Bedouin more. He convinced the British command that conventional warfare would be too costly in the Arabian deserts and would put British and Arab troops at risk. Instead, they'd need to hit hard, hit quick, and remain swift and mobile. They'd use small units, armed with explosives and mounted on camels, and they'd drift in and out of the desert like ghosts, striking terror into the Ottoman lines. Communication was still a problem, but Lawrence had the solution here too. Speaking fluent Arabic and fully aware of Arabian culture customs, he acted as a liaison between the Arabian Prince Faisal and the British High Command, orchestrating what he referred to as a war of detachment and writing his name in the history books in the process. If Lawrence was a unique character, then the Arabian campaigns were a unique theatre. Less focused on trench warfare and pitched battles, the Arabian Revolt was characterized by the guerrilla tactics of the Bedouin and long-range missions that were way ahead of their time. Arabia may have been a minor front in World War I, but it would shape the future of warfare in a big way. While Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces bedded down into trenches along the eastern frontier, a new front was opening up in southern Europe. Eager to force into Italy from the north, overrunning the Veneto plains that lay behind Italian lines on the Isonzo, Austrian troops mounted an offensive on May 15, 1916. They opened fire on Italian positions at Trentino, laying down a thick carpet of artillery that reduced the land to waste and left nowhere for the Italians to hide. From here, they drove toward their objective, Asiago on the Venetian plain. The Straf expedition, as it was known, looked to be successful. The Italians holed up along the Isonzo River were in danger of being cut off. Perhaps it was a case of too much, too fast for the Austrians. It became difficult to keep advance units adequately supplied, and ammunition began to dwindle. They took Asiago on May 28th, but failed to make any further progress. The Italians were digging in, keeping the Austrians from sweeping out into the open plain behind them. At Pasubio, Bovegno, and Sukna, and at the Buol Pass and Astico Valley, Italian troops hastily erected a defensive line. Prepared for the worst, they repelled desperate Austrian attacks before the invaders ran out of steam. By June 2nd, Italy was back on the offensive. 2 days later, a breakthrough on the Eastern Front sent Austria's imperial leaders into a panic. Russian troops had breached the empire for the first time. A slow counter-advance reclaimed most of Italy's lost territory, while the Austro-Hungarians would concentrate on the eastern sector of the front along the Isonzo for the remainder of the war, where, let's not forget, the final death knell would sound for the empire. Why was the Alpine Front abandoned? After all, the Austrians had seen greater successes on this front than they had on the Isonzo before 1918. One major reason was logistics. The Austrian advance ran out of steam largely because of the Alpine barrier that disrupted their supply lines. High altitude maneuvers through desperate terrain cost both sides dearly, and fighting in this type of environment was just not feasible in the 1910s. It would still be savagely difficult today. Due to this, and due to the limited action seen in this mountainous landscape, the Alpine Front remains one of the lesser combat theatres of the war. World War I was fought from France to Russia, from Egypt to Iran, from Camerun to Mozambique. Men from Mumbai died alongside those from Massachusetts, Manchester and Melbourne. Civilian communities were devastated from Belgium to Basra. This was a truly global conflict, and yet the focus still rests on the western and eastern fronts that have come to symbolize the character and identity of the Great War. Hopefully, by shedding some light on the lesser-known fronts and theaters of war, we can expand this understanding a little further, telling the stories of those victories and advances, those crippling defeats that took place outside of the scope of popular history books. But what do you think about this list? Is there anything you would change? Any front you believe we missed? Also let us know, if you were forced to fight on a front, which one out of these would you choose? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Big thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can join the action for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox. Just hit up my link in the pinned comment or video description to get started. New or returning after 6 months? You're in for a treat. A hefty bonus pack awaits you, stacked with several premium vehicles, a stash of in-game currency, and more.